I've been a nurse in the oncology ward for years, so I'm familiar with loss and suffering. You develop a kind of emotional callus working here, which you need to stay functional. But there was one night I'll never forget, one that rattled me to my core and made me question what I knew about life and death. It was late, close to the end of my shift, when they wheeled in a new patient, Mr. Kerrigan. He was an elderly man, thin as a rail, and was being admitted for end-stage cancer. It was a grim diagnosis, and even though we were used to cases like his, there was something about Mr. Kerrigan that set me on edge. Maybe it was the quiet, hollow look in his eyes, or the unnatural chill in his room, but he seemed haunted. I spent the rest of the evening checking on him occasionally, offering water or shifting him to ease his pain. He barely spoke, his gaze always fixed on a distant point just past me, as though he were staring into another world. At one point, I asked if he was comfortable, and he only whispered, "He's coming soon," before shutting his eyes. I brushed it off as the hallucinations we sometimes see in terminal patients. But something about his words stuck with me. Finally, it was time for me to go. I left Mr. Kerrigan's room and walked down the hall to the nurse's station, gathering my things to head home. But as I passed his room one last time, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. A chilling, deep laughter echoing from inside. It wasn't Mr. Kerrigan's voice, it was something darker, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Heart pounding, I cautiously opened his door. The room was completely dark, save for the dim light spilling in from the hallway. I froze in shock as my eyes adjusted. Standing in the far corner of the room was a shadowy figure, tall and pitch black, darker than anything I'd ever seen. It had no distinct features, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. I fumbled for the light switch, flipping it on, and just like that, the figure was gone. The room was empty. I hurried over to Mr. Kerrigan's bed, trying to reassure myself that it was just a trick of the light. But when I checked his pulse, there was nothing. His skin was already growing cold. He was gone. I stood there for a few minutes, grappling with what I'd seen. I don't believe in spirits or supernatural entities. I'm a nurse, trained in science and reason. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night wasn't just a shadow. It felt real, almost like it had come to collect him, to usher him into the next life. I still don't talk about it with anyone at work. They'd probably think I was crazy, but every time I pass that room, I can't help but glance at the corner, half expecting to see that dark figure waiting for its next soul. Working in a morgue is no one's dream job, but after years on the night shift, I'm used to it. The dim lighting, the cold silence, the smell of formaldehyde, these are all just part of the environment. Handling the bodies of the deceased is just routine. But there was one encounter that I'll never forget, one that still haunts me when I close my eyes at night. One evening, a young man who had died in a car accident was brought in. He looked like he'd been in his mid-20s, maybe younger, and he had that look that some bodies have, as if the violence of the impact had frozen him in a twisted, unnatural way. His limbs were contorted, his face pale, and his eyes half closed, as though he was in a state of perpetual surprise. After laying him on the examination table, I went over to the sink to wash my hands. My back was to the body, and the room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I scrubbed my hands, preparing myself for the task ahead, when a strange feeling of unease washed over me. I shook it off, assuming it was just nerves. But when I turned around, my heart dropped. The body lay exactly as I'd left it, except his head had turned, facing directly at me. His eyes, which had been half closed before, were now wide open, staring at me with an intensity that seemed almost intentional. His mouth was contorted in a sickening grin, the corners of his lips pulled back in a way that exposed his teeth. It was as though he was grinning at me, taunting me. For a moment, I stood there, completely frozen. I'd seen post-mortem twitching before, of course, Sometimes muscles can contract after death, causing the body to move. But this was different. There was a sinister awareness in his expression that didn't feel like a simple muscle spasm. It felt deliberate. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to shake off the fear. I was a professional after all, and I needed to get on with the job. But as I began the autopsy, the feeling of his gaze never left me. Even though I knew he was dead, I felt like he was watching me, his eyes locked onto me with that horrific, mocking grin. Eventually, I completed my work and left the room, but the memory of that night still lingers. At one time, I worked at a skilled nursing center there, and most of my shifts were spent on the Alzheimer's ward. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it was rewarding in its own way. You get used to the stories, the confusion, the way patients can seem like they're speaking to people who aren't there. But sometimes there are things that you just can't explain. It was one particularly quiet evening when I found myself in the laundry room, sorting through a cart of dirty sheets. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed above me, casting an eerie glow on the white walls. I focused on my task, the soft shuffle of my own footsteps, mixing with the quiet noises of the facility, the distant hum of machines, and the occasional rattle of the hallway doors. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate shuffle behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I paused, not sure if I had imagined it. The noise stopped, and for a moment, I thought I had simply been hearing things, but then I felt it, the cold, unmistakable pressure on my shoulder. Like someone had just laid their hand there. I froze. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I finally forced myself to look, heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. The laundry room was empty, just as it had been when I entered. I glanced around quickly. The door was still shut tight, just as I'd left it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It had to have been my imagination, right? But that sensation, that icy hand on my shoulder, it felt too real. I tried to shake it off, but the eerie feeling lingered with me all night. The next few days were uneventful, but then I started noticing a strange pattern. One of the patients, Mrs. Randall, a sweet elderly woman with severe Alzheimer's, began to complain about something unsettling. She'd tell the nurses and me about a man who would come into her room at night, standing in the shadows, watching her. She said he was very handsome and wore a black suit. At first, we chalked it up to the confusion that came with her condition. She was often lost in her own world, sometimes speaking of long-lost relatives or past events as though they were happening right in front of her. But over the course of a few nights, her complaints grew more persistent. She would wake up in a panic, calling out about the man. "He's here again, standing at the foot of my bed. He's not real, is he?" she would say, clutching the blankets to her chest in terror. I would reassure her, telling her it was just a dream, that she was safe and that there was no one in her room. Still, every night the story was the same. "The man in the black suit, he's here," she would murmur, and every night I would dismiss it as just another symptom of her illness. She was losing touch with reality. She wasn't seeing anyone. But I started feeling unsettled. Something about her insistence, her eyes wide with fear as she described the man, left me uneasy. One night I couldn't sleep. The night shift had been quiet, and I was doing my rounds when I passed Mrs. Randall's room. She was awake again, sitting up in bed, her frail hands clutching the sides of the mattress. Her eyes were wide, darting around the room. I stopped in the doorway. "Is he here?" she asked in a shaky voice. I stepped into the room, trying to offer comfort. "No, Mrs. Randall, there's no one here." She looked at me for a moment, her gaze piercing, as if she were seeing something that I couldn't. "Oh," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's right behind you, honey." I froze, my blood running cold. I turned quickly, but the room was empty, the shadows dancing harmlessly in the dim light. My heart was racing. "There's no one there, Mrs. Randall. You're safe." but she only smiled weakly, her eyes glimmering with something I couldn't understand. "He's standing right behind you." I felt a chill sweep through the room, and despite my best efforts to stay calm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, Mrs. Randall died in her sleep. I didn't sleep well for days after that. The image of her eyes, wide with fear, haunted me. And the last thing she had said, the warning about someone being behind me, it kept replaying in my mind.